So this presentation is meant to help you understand the origins of photography. Um, as you've started to learn in your research, it has been around for a while, and the digital version of photography that we all use and learn is one version, but there are many others. Um, and it has its origins dating all the way back to the 1800s when Louis Daguerre invented what's called the daguerreotype. So the word photography is derived from two Greek words, photos, which means light, and graphene, which means to draw. So we are literally drawing with light. So the first photos were not very permanent. They were made with highly toxic chemicals on glass plates, and they were just not a very stable kind of a photo. The technique was also not a very portable way to shoot photos. And so you can see in this photo, or this picture over here, is what's called a wet plate photographer. And so he's on the road. He is doing his photo work. The part here at the front is the camera. It's the lens part of it. There's this thing called a bellows, which connects to this big black box. And inside of that box, when the guy puts the two together, this is a light-safe environment, and he puts a piece of glass with wet chemicals on it into that box and then opens the lens right here with he has a little called a cable release. He opens it and he's able to create an exposure. So the exposure of the light on the chemical causes a chemical reaction, which makes the silver in that chemical turn dark. And so that is how we get a photograph. You can see this isn't a very, portable, practical way to make photos, but that's how it started. So the early process, eventually they moved away from glass plates and they moved to pieces of plastic called a negative. Negatives were first made on glass, and then for some time they were made on metal, and eventually they became plastic. And Eastman Kodak developed these early ideas, and so imagery was captured in negative, sort of the reverse of what it was, and then it's projected through an enlarger and you get an actual photo. And we actually have some enlargers in the art room, which I will show you another time. But that is an old-fashioned way, an old process of how to make photography, how to make photographs. So in my opinion, in this class, my main goal is to teach you how to make a photograph, not how to take a photograph. There's a difference. We all can take photos. We all have done tons of selfies and lots of, quick little things with our phone. And we've gotten to where there's so many pictures, it's so easy to have pictures that it's difficult for us to imagine a time when people maybe only had 2 or 3 photographs of themselves in their entire lifetime. Kind of a weird thought, but it's true. And those photos were expensive and they took time to make. Eventually, leading up into the 1940s into the 50s, a lot more people could start to afford a camera and film, and so more people had photos, but it's still a roll of film can only shoot 24 to 36 images. And so even then, you're limiting yourself to that amount on a roll. And usually people got all of those pictures printed. Nowadays, we barely ever print our photos, and we shoot hundreds every day, probably. So what I want you to think about in this class is I want you to start to challenge yourself to really think of yourself as an artist. You're not just shooting photos randomly, but you are trying to make a photograph. And so the keys to making a beautiful photograph are composition, lighting, having an unusual point of view, zooming in or zooming out on your subject matter, thinking about size and texture and the relationship of the objects to each other, and then learning how to use the rule of thirds. And we're going to talk about all of those in just a moment. This photo you see here is from the 1800s, so it's an old photograph, but I think it's quite beautiful. It shows, actually I think it's from the early 1900s, excuse me, but it shows milkweed pods. Those are something that's opening up in the prairie right now here at school, and they release their little seed pods. You can see them here. They're kind of silky looking, and that's how the milkweed spreads. But I think it's a beautiful photograph because of the composition. The rule of thirds was used. Your eye is drawn up and in. There's a beautiful range of tones in this photo, from black all the way to white and grays in between. All of these things make for a good photograph. It's also kind of an unusual point of view. It's a subject that we maybe wouldn't normally look at. It's just a weed, but the photographer chose to zoom in and give us some of those textural details. So compositional techniques that I want you to learn in this class that will give you the power to shoot better photographs are the following. Leading lines, and we're going to see examples of them in just a moment. But leading lines direct the viewer's eyes into the image, creating principle of movement. Rule of thirds divides the image into thirds vertically and horizontally, and where those thirds intersect are the areas of most interest to the viewer. It creates a sense of asymmetrical balance, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Fill the frame, where the whole subject, you've zoomed in on the subject and the whole subject takes up the entire picture frame, and it might even go off of the frame. It's so large. Level horizon is another great technique, especially if you're shooting landscapes or cityscapes. You want a level, straight horizon. You don't want a slanting horizon. Framing is another one where you use elements in the photo to frame your subject. So maybe you are shooting a photo of your friend, maybe for their senior pictures even, and you have them stand between two trees, and the leaves and the branches of the trees sort of frame them. That's an example of framing. And then an unusual point of view, changing the way the viewer sees the subject. We normally look at things head on, but what if we go way above the subject and look down? What if we look at the subject, we lay on our stomach and we're right there at ant's eye view? So changing your point of view can sometimes be a great way to compose a photograph. So these images are examples of an unusual point of view. The one on the left by Harry Callahan of a woman in the city, and the one on the right of a horse by Alfred Stieglitz. In both of these images, we are looking at a picture in a way that we normally wouldn't. So the woman on the left, her head's been kind of cut off, which you learn, if you're taking a picture of someone, you don't really want to cut off their head. But in this instance, it's been cropped really tight to where what we do see is her mouth and her jewels and her fur coat. I always think of her as kind of talking like this. Oh my God, did you see what he did? She's kind of a gossip. That's how I see her. Her name is Marge. It's not really, but that's what I imagine her to be. You can see that she looks like she's fairly wealthy, but she's an older woman. Her teeth don't look real great. People back in the 50s smoked a lot, and she has smoker teeth, so it's kind of gross. But the photographer was very smart in that, here the lighting on the necklace, the lighting of her shirt, the lighting on her teeth, and then the lighting on the earring leads you back into her face so that you can see all the elements that he wants you to see. The one on the right is of a horse's groin, which you don't normally look at on a horse. But the photographer zoomed in, and it really becomes more of a study about line and texture. So sometimes playing around with size and scale can be really fun, especially we have the ability to do a lot with Photoshop. You can select things and enlarge them bigger than they're supposed to be, or make things smaller than they're supposed to be. The two pictures on the top are kind of silly postcards from the early 1930s, 1940s. The one on the left showing, this is from a garden catalog, and they're trying to say that their onions are way bigger than anyone else's onions if you buy their seed. Just kind of silly. And the one on the right is called Salted, and it's supposed to be this guy is hunting, and he finds this giant rabbit Again, if you see a rabbit that big, you better run. Okay, that's way too big of a rabbit. But they've played around with size and scale by the way that they've enlarged the picture. The two on the bottom are actually objects that are quite small normally, but because of the way the photographer photographed them, they're given a sense of almost like glory or honor. They're seen as art objects, but all they really are, these are just saws, little saws, and this is a tiny little chemical stir stick, a glass stir stick. But both of them, because of how they're lit and because of how they're presented, take on a look of art. The rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds is this thing where the lines intersect. You divide the space vertically into thirds, and you also divide it horizontally into thirds. And where those thirds intersect, so like right here, over here, those are spots where it's of most interest. Another way you can recognize the rule of thirds is this sort of capital L shape that happens. It can be a forward L or a backwards L. We call that asymmetrical balance, where it is in balance, but the balance is slightly off the usual center point. It's using the sides as a way. This one, again, the rule of thirds, these weird, creepy little dolls laying there like they're in prison or something. I don't know. Kind of a creepy photo, but it gives you that idea of the rule of thirds. So where they are is one of the thirds. These photos are both by Alfred Stieglitz. He was a very famous master of photography, early photography. He also happened to be Georgia O'Keeffe's husband, and so these are her hands over here. Georgia O'Keeffe, the artist who painted all the famous flowers and skulls from New Mexico. He's using this technique called leading lines, and there aren't actual lines in the photograph, but the way that the lighting is done, the shape of her hands with light leading you up and in. This thing on her finger here is a thimble, so she's wearing a little thimble for sewing, and that lighting leads you up and into the photo. Also notice this beautiful negative space. It's almost like the shape of a flower. It's really, really well done. Your eye goes straight to her hands, and they are led up and in and around. On this one, the line, of course, is the line of the buttons leading you down the back of the dress, but then also the lighting on her neck leads you up into her head and back around. And again, you have this really lovely negative space that the photographer has created. Fill the Frame is an example. These are both by Ansel Adams, who's another really famous photographer. He shot a lot of photos of national parks during the WPA work project in the Depression. And so Ansel Adams is famous for, he wrote a series of books about how to develop film, how to develop photos, and how to do photography. He's sort of thought of as the grandfather of photography, of modern photography specifically. So you can see both of these. His subject is filling up the space. Sorry about the bell. There we go. This fern that's here is the only one that's lighter, and it filling there's ferns everywhere. So the whole space is filled with ferns, but we notice the one because it's different. So we're creating emphasis through difference. This one on the right is a great example of not only filling the frame with the subject, but also the idea of threes and fives. Having threes and fives in a composition is very pleasing. And also the rule of thirds, you might argue, as well in this image. So a couple of techniques going on here. Level Horizon, this is another one by Ansel Adams of Yosemite. And like I said, he shot a lot of photos of national parks. Really beautiful use of that level horizon. Creates a sense of peace and tranquility. Imogene Cunningham is a female photographer during a time when there really weren't too many females doing photography. Her photographs are really interesting. She has sort of two styles. One is that she does a lot of portraiture but her portraits are definitely unusual. And then she also does photographs of flowers. So the portrait on the left, this one is actually a self-portrait. That is Imogene Cunningham when she was an older woman. And you can see she's holding the camera in her hands. She's using these mirrors and windows to kind of frame the whole photograph. So it's definitely about the space and the light and the reflection, but it's also about her being in the photo. The one on the right is of a woman portrait, and she's done a great job of framing her with the building, the window, the signage, all frame up the woman in the photograph. Think about it, if this photo was, if these lines weren't here, I don't think it would be as interesting to look at. Here's a couple more by Imogene Cunningham. She has some photographs of flowers, magnolia, and calla lilies, and again using leading lines with lighting to lead you up into the space, and also filling the frame with the entire subject of the photograph. Edward Weston is another master of photography, one of the early masters of photography. He lived in California, and he is really known for his photographs of sand dunes and natural objects such as squash and peppers and trees, and a lot of times he also photographed the nude figure in the natural environment. So some of his imagery I can't really show you here, but you might see it when you look at photos in your own research. These are a couple examples of his. I love how he makes the fruits or the vegetables feel almost like they're figures embracing. His imagery is very sensual, and I don't mean that in a weird, creepy way. I mean there's a strong sense to these of touch and of beauty. He loves to fill the frame with the subject. Excuse me. Paul Caponegro is another master of early photography. If you look at these, you can see several of the techniques we've talked about. Of course, there's rule of thirds, both horizontal and vertical, but he's also using that level horizon that we talked about earlier. Sorry. And one might argue that he is even using leading lines. The imagery, the reflection in the water of the branches and the trees leads you back into the space, and then the water takes you further back in. These roots of the tree lead you up into the tree, and then you see this giant rock over here. So in photography, like I said, I want you to think about making art. And so we also think about, in addition to those composition techniques, we also want to remember and think about the elements and principles of design, which you've learned about in Intro to Art, and you've learned about in Intro to Digimedia, and you should have learned about in most of the art classes you took. So remember that the elements of art, that's this list on the left, are like the ingredients in a recipe. So they're like the eggs, the flour, the sugar that you put in to make cookies. And then the principles are how you use those elements. So they're kind of like the directions in a recipe. So you're going to use, beat the eggs slowly would be a principle of baking. Whereas here we have the principles of art. Okay? So elements and principles are important to remember and to understand and to think about as we're creating our photographs. Thanks for listening. Make sure you've taken some notes. If you want to go back and look at some of the art, you can. All of the photographers I showed you in this unit, of course, we're doing black and white photography because these are what I would consider sort of the masters of the original old film photography. We're going to learn about a lot of contemporary artists as well, but to start out, I wanted you to have the old school, if you will. So, thanks.